Highlighting the principles that work for you.
Thank you for watching Forward, Upward, Onward Together as a part of RBNTV. My name is Carey, and I'm delighted that you've joined us. It's an honor to have Jessica Pearce Rotundi, author of the acclaimed book, What We Inherit. The book is as much about her family's history as it is about the history of the United States in the mid-20th century. In gripping, compelling narrative, Jessica shares that she grew up hearing about her Uncle Jack, who she was told disappeared in the Vietnam War in the 1970s. Later in 2009, her mother passed of cancer. Jessica was left with her mother's possessions of CIA reports, of family letters, Southeast Asian maps that told a riveting and secretive story about her Uncle Jack's demise. For decades, her family sought to uncover the truth of Jack's whereabouts from the US government. Jessica assumed the role of uncovering more information about what happened to her uncle. And this book chronicles that amazing journey and story. And so, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us at Forward, Upward, Onward Together.
Thank you for having me. This is very exciting.
Yeah. First of all, congratulations on an amazing book. I read it. I think the book was released in April, if I'm correct, in April 2020.
Yeah.
Yes, it was in the early parts of the pandemic. And, I remember just being so engrossed by your soaring prose, this amazing piece of writing. And as a history buff myself, I really found it just so interesting, your own rich family history and your national, history that you spoke of. But tell me, as I said, it was your mother's possessions that led you to that. But what compelled you to write this amazing book?
Great question. So in the wake of my mother's loss, I was 23 years old. I was crazy, wild with grief. I didn't know what to do with the rest of my life. And I was kind of looking for this last message from Mom. And what I found instead was that she had lost her brother at the same age I lost her. So it almost became a roadmap through grieving and through uncovering my family's personal history. I really uncovered this secret war in Laos, which I never learned about in American public education and public school. So the goals of the book were not only to uncover my family's role in the CIA-led secret war in Laos, but really the American involvement and culpability in this country that was left the most heavily bombed country in the entire world. So the book is deeply personal memoir, it's travelogue, but it's also investigative reporting. I spent 10 years talking to CIA officers and veterans and refugees for this book, so I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, congratulations. I can see that a lot of work went into it. And you spoke about that the book derived out of a wellspring of loss. And you begin the book in a very interesting way, a very profound way in the prologue. You say that your family has this very incredible and sad history of loss. Your grandfather was a World War II veteran and was parachuted in a plane and spent, 2 years in a gulag, a concentration camp?
Yeah.
You spoke of your mother's loss, your grandfather's brother drowned in a lake, your Uncle Jack demise, but in this grief and in this wellspring of grief and loss, there's this image that you share that even though your grandfather never ate soup after his time in, as a prisoner of war, that you all would still play with the soup spoon that he used during that time there. And so juxtaposed against his grief, I saw that there was just this incredible amount of hope. I just at the very beginning of your book. And so for me, that there was this, I could see the amazing amount of love from you as a family had, but the reality of life and of grief, and that certainly came through in the book.
Thank you. And I think we lost a child in pretty much every generation. There are these bonds that we have. My aunt and uncle who lost a child, they're kind of like second parents to me. I'm kind of like a daughter to them. And so I think through understanding how past generations of my family dealt with this kind of unfathomable loss, we're able to move forward in our own lives and still kind of bring the past with us. Like my grandfather's prison spoon, which really evoked a horrible time in his life, but he held up for his grandchildren as a symbol of survival and his ability to keep hope. going. Yeah.
So, during the book, there were these discussions of you all at the dinner table. And so the question for me is, when you all spoke about your Uncle Jack, what did they tell you about him? What did they say that happened? He would have been a young man when he passed. What was their explanation?
Great question. He was 24 years old when his plane was shot down by a Russian surface-to-air missile over the neutral country of Laos. He was on a bombing mission about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I didn't know any of this growing up. I mean, growing up, we talked about Grandpa all the time. His father, my grandfather, was, again, that World War II hero, parachuted out of a burning plane, was captured by the Nazis, and survived those 3 years in Stalag 17 camp. So because my grandfather survived, I think he always believed that his son did too. But all I really knew about Jack was that he disappeared when he was young in Vietnam. And then he never came home. There was a photograph of him next to my mother's high school portrait, bright blue eyes, really thick, kind of nerdy glasses. Handsome kid, but he was kind of always preserved in this childlike state, right? He was just kind of on the cusp of becoming a man. And, he passed away or disappeared at the same age I lost my mother. And so, I started this book when I was 23. I'm now in my mid 30s. And I think as I got older, my perspective kind of shifted. I kind of saw the story more from my grandfather's perspective than the daughter's perspective. And as you know, in the book, Carey, it goes between my grandfather waking up and learning that his son is missing, and then me, the morning my mom passes away, going back and finding her things. So you really have a father looking for a son and a daughter looking for a mother as well, which felt to me like the only way to tell this story, because there were so many different types of love I wanted to kind of capture.
Wow. You spoke about the journey of research of the book. And you said that you spoke with CIA officers and you spent 10 years researching the book. What was that like? Just spending so much time poring over historical documents and speaking with so many people who would have been critical in the campaign, the U.S. campaign at that time.
Yeah. I mean, when I first started researching this book, much of what happened during the war was still completely classified, and much of it still is. When I traveled to Laos in 2013, kind of retracing my grandfather's trip from the 70s, you can be jailed still for talking about this war in Laos. Journalists have been imprisoned and even killed for going against the state or reporting on this. So, I was in my young 20s. I don't think I really understood the risks fully. I was still kind of in that grieving state where I felt like nothing else can happen to me because the worst already has. I just kind of went undercover as a tourist to kind of explore the country on the ground there. And then when I came home, the biggest, I think, help that I found was really these CIA agents. Getting them on the record was so tough. I'm a young girl. My family member's obviously missing, so I'm not an impartial journalist like I would be in another story, but I'm also female. Even when I was trying to sell the book, editors told me, well, books about war by women don't really sell, honey. Or like, it could be a memoir about cancer, but not about war. So getting these men who had seen so much, and they were mostly men, and getting them to trust me was really an exercise in perseverance. Luckily, I inherited some of that from my grandfather, who just never gave up on his son. So I never gave up on calling these people. And there are 2 people in the book, which I hope readers read about, who were just so helpful in sharing their lives with me. And many of them had never spoken about the war to their own families. So it's the first time you're really seeing a lot of firsthand accounts of the secret war in the book.
Yeah, you call it a secret war. And to be honest with you, and I'm a history buff, I knew very little about the secret war in Laos. The Vietnam War received so much attention.
Yes.
But tell us a little bit about the U.S. campaign or the secret war or incursion in Laos.
Sure. So it really borders Vietnam, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is we often study in relationship to the Vietnam War, was basically a trail of supplies, men, and arms that went between the 2 countries, also into Cambodia. So the U.S., in hoping to kind of shorten the war, started bombing a neutral country, and it is bombed more heavily than Germany and Japan combined in World War II. There were over 2.5 million tons of cluster bombs dropped over Laos, and we never ever hear about it. Everyone that served in Laos, there weren't technically troops on the ground. They were only CIA, so there were secret officers. And the majority of the deaths in the war were not Americans, but Hmong. So it was a hill tribe living in kind of the mountains of Laos. There was a Hmong general who I spoke to his son for the book, who was really commanding all these troops. There was an incredible loss of life, to the point where when the Americans lost and had to kind of abandon ship, a lot of the Hmong families had to also leave the country or risk being killed or persecuted. So we have a huge Hmong population in the United States today, California and Ohio, that just had their lives upended. I mean, this war completely changed the landscape of that country and those families for generations. And there it's called the American War. But of course, in America, we call it the Secret War because it wasn't on our doorsteps. And the craziest thing to me, when I was in Laos, I went to the town my uncle was bombing the night he disappeared. And I saw a laundry line next to a beautiful little home. And there was an American Superman pajamas, like a little boy's pajamas dangling over a laundry line. And, you know, Superman is a symbol of American heroism and really a symbol for good in the world. And it was hanging over a bomb crater left by American bombs. So the juxtaposition of that for me, where my family didn't even tell me about this war. I didn't learn about it in school. Here, it's literally in people's front yards. That was so jarring to me. So from that point on, I really became determined to tell the story of the war at large, not just my family, but really all the men and women who lost their lives, their homes, their livelihoods, their safety at the expense of, you know, an American bombing campaign.
Yeah, it's a tremendous and very sad bit of U.S. history, anti-communist history. You spoke about your visit in Laos, and I had so many favorite parts of the book, to be honest. But I loved reading. I particularly loved reading, your visit to Laos. It seemed very personal, and you described. I felt like I was there. You was able to smell the aromas, of landing in Laos, the thick, humid air. You really transported myself, the reader, there as well. What was that like? You said that you describe yourself as a little bit naive, as a 20-year-old white woman, trekking through Laos, trying to uncover a very uncomfortable history. Were you well received during your time there?
Yeah, I mean, so it's further than I'd ever traveled at that point in my life. I was a journalist at the time and making very little money. So I saved up for years for this trip. I actually used money my grandfather had given me for report cards, like $5 here, $10 there, to go towards
a long way. Yeah, eventually, right?
But yeah, I was one of the few white women in the airport, the only white woman in the airport when I got to more rural Laos. And I think that's an experience a lot of people have. But as a white woman, I hadn't had that often before. So that was kind of a lesson in what it's like to kind of stand out a little bit in a crowd. And then Lao culture is a little more separation of the sexes. It's kind of more polite, I should say. So coming from Brooklyn and New York, where everyone's loud and in your face, I was just blown away by the hospitality and the kindness that people showed me. I clearly had an American accent, and the fact that I was still allowed into restaurants. And, when the history is so kind of violent and different was, I felt a tremendous sense of gratitude, but also guilt throughout my entire time there, especially when I got closer to the scenes of the bombing and the villagers. There's an incredible moment in the book. I don't want to give too much away, but when I'm working with my guide, who does not like me, and for good reason, being an American woman, I think he sees in me a lot of the things that a lot of the ugly side of the legacy of American-Lao relations. But when we get to the village, it turns out he is related to someone there. And then the story kinds of shifts, and all the feelings that he had towards me become more clear, right? Because we both lost someone and something in this conflict. And from that point on, the trust that we kind of began to have in each other was incredible. And that kind of
and it's amazing that, you two were from different ends of the world, very different cultures, but you were able to find, some common ground among each other. It's a commonality of humanity that was able to just shine through.
Yeah, and he was also very much better at texting than that. This is before texting was a big thing. It was like 2013. He taught me how to use emojis, so I'm still grateful.
That's funny. You said that you were a journalist and a writer at that time, and I would imagine that would have been good training for the writing process of the book. Did it help at all? You're writing a very personal story, and would that have been very different? What was the writing process like for the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's what I struggled with the most, was how to present this story. As a journalist by training, we're trained to be impartial observers, report the facts, nothing more. You really want to do a deep dive into what happened when, the time, the date, but there's not really as much emotion necessarily in it if you're being strict about it. And I think I also had, those words about women writing war in my mind, that it shouldn't be emotional, that it should be more, quote unquote, typically masculine, right? But in the course of my research, I realized I couldn't write that book. How could I? I'm a direct descendant of the people that I'm writing about. And that really became solidified for me when I was in bed, as I often was in Brooklyn, early morning before I went to work full time, with boxes of papers. And as I was going through the declassified documents, something cold and metallic fell onto my lap, and it was actually Jack's dog tags, which I didn't know my family had. And touching those, I could really imagine what my grandfather felt holding them, what my mother felt holding them. And from that point on, I knew that for history to become real, it kind of had to be personal. And if it's okay, I actually wanted to mention your grandfather's book as well, which I absolutely loved. What Manner of Man Is This by Sir Orville Turnquest. And he also writes about an incredible point in the history of the Bahamas. He talks about, the Duke of Windsor in Governor's House, right? He describes this door that the Duke left behind that has his initials on it that he got, I think, as a teenager, as a gift. He brought this fancy door all the way to the Bahamas, installed it, and then was in such a hurry to leave, he left the door. And
it's still there.
It's still there, right?
Right.
And your grandfather every day would walk through this literal history, like the weight of this, he would have to move to enter his own home. And that was so striking to me. I love that detail because it wasn't just this thing that happened years ago. It was something that he was still touching and feeling today. What an incredible symbol. So I think most of the history books that I love are ones that don't just give us statistics on numbers of dead or number of taxes raised. It really is the human element that I find the most fascinating, that kind of makes people care, especially when it's something where you're trying to either correct history or tell a version that hasn't really been told before. I think it's so important to connect with readers emotionally to really see them through.
Yeah, I think that the book and the book, your book, and I think my grandfather's book were successful in that they tell a history that is deeply personal, and history is really personal. And we have to continue to personalize it. We have to continue to retell it and to uncover more and more facts. And it seems as if you really did that in the book as well, through your research. I read somewhere that, in your writing process, that you would write drafts and drafts, and then, a document would be declassified, and then you'd have to write the entire, that entire bit over again. And so while that may have been, a very difficult part of the writing, I would imagine that that also would have been a very rewarding aspect of the writing process as well.
Very much so. I mean, you want to get the history right. And history is kind of always in flux. I think as science changes, as things get declassified, as people come forward and speak on the record more bravely and publicly, we do get more information. I mean, look at Columbus Day. We just celebrated that in America, or didn't celebrate it last Monday. There are still people arguing for this view of Columbus as the discoverer of, the continent, when really there's a history of violence and, a lot of problematic things as well. So I think history isn't this static thing. It's still living and breathing. And for me, writing the book, I was almost done with it. I was done with it 3 times over, but I was in my book club and a young woman said, "Oh, my dad was in Laos in the 70s. And I kind of said, "Oh, was your dad in the CIA?" And she was like, "How did you know my dad was CIA?" So he became this source, Richard Trencher, in the book that really shed a lot of light on the CIA's higher level relationship with Russia and Laos and Vietnam and China during the war. And I would not have had that access if I hadn't taken the time to kind of stop the polishing and go back and really incorporate this really, I think, core message of the book. So I think research, even after the book is done, of course, there's things I'd love to add, but I think it's up to the next author, and hopefully a Hmong or Lao author will come forward and write their version of the story as well.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be interesting to hear it from their perspective as well. Though yours is incredibly rich and moving, certainly emotional. Speaking of emotional, was it therapeutic at all? The writing process, or even the publishing process, this entire journey to where it is today?
One of my favorite memoirists, Mary Karr, has this incredible line that writing memoir is like getting to spend time with people no longer on this side of the grass. And for me, my God, I wish I could talk to my grandfather again. I miss my mother so much. It never goes away. But writing this was like getting to spend time with them again, seeing their handwriting again, hearing my mother's voice through her letters to senators and representatives, like fighting on behalf of her brother. That reminded me of her fight against her cancer and how hard she fought for my sister and I when we were little kids. And I think in that sense, the book was incredibly therapeutic. That said, it also took me 10 years to write. So, that's a big chunk of my early 20s, right into my 30s. And I think there were times when it was also a heavy thing to get up and start your day and end your day with kind of a sadder story. But there was this incredible lightness I felt. I was lucky enough to record the audiobook in New York City 1 week before everything shut down with the pandemic. And I remember recording the last line, like saying it out loud made it feel so much more real. And that was kind of that closure that I hadn't had in 10 years of writing. It really took, that last breath of letting it out to kind of feel that peace that I was definitely searching for across my time in Southeast Asia. Yeah.
What was the most rewarding part of being, of this process, and perhaps the most difficult part of this process?
I think the most rewarding was the day Salman Rushdie said he was going to blurb my book. I grew up idolizing this man, reading his books and just thinking he was a god, right? And to have him read my family's story and write me a note about my grandfather and my mom, that was just so cool and so validating, especially given the concerns about, my gender, my qualifications, blah, blah, blah. It just felt like the coolest thing. And I think the hardest part, was knowing my mom wasn't here to see it. It's one of those things where, my God, I wish I could just hand her a copy of it and be like, Mom, we did it. So if you look at the book, actually, one of the very first pages says "For Mom" on it, and it's dedicated to her. So hopefully wherever she is, she can see it someday. But that was probably the toughest thing. But also still a celebration of her life. So people now are contacting me who dated her, ex-boyfriends, friends are all coming out of the woodwork. And it's been kind of cool. It's like we're all getting to kind of talk and celebrate her again through the book, which is unexpected, but kind of joyous part of being an author as well. Yeah.
I am so proud of the book, and so I can only imagine that she is beaming with pride at the book. And congratulations at so much praise and acclaim from Salman Rushdie to the historian Ron Chertow to so many others. I've read just an incredible amount of praise on the book, and so I would imagine that that's also gratifying that 10 years of work has really been well received by the public as well. What advice would you give for budding writers, persons who may be interested in the writing process?
I think for me, it's don't try to stay in your lane. I think a very commonly quoted advice is write what you know. And in this case, I'm writing about what I don't know, right? I basically took on a government and a war that I'd never learned about in school and things I'd never had conversation-wise with my family, and explored that. And that became the richest journey I've had. And I think people should not write about what they know necessarily, but what excites them, what interests them. And because it might be a long journey, again, it took me 10 years, you really have to be able to love something enough to spend every day with it, or at least a couple months at a stretch, right? You really have to love what you do, because I think that shows in the writing. I think I've definitely tried to write things I thought I should write, and they just didn't work. And that pull is something that the author should feel and the reader should hopefully feel as well.
With the book's title, What We Inherit, it doesn't have a question mark. What do we inherit? And it's not quite a command, right? We inherit. It's not quite declarative. So the question that I do ask then, without giving away too much of the book, so much of us have family histories that are fascinating, that are sad, that are tragic, that are uplifting. But what really do we inherit? What did the book and the journey teach you about what we as a people inherit?
That's a great question. And then I actually took the line from a Lord Byron poem.
At the beginning of it.
Yeah, and so the Greek myth of Prometheus, most people I'm sure know it, but it's this Greek titan that gave fire to man. And as punishment, the gods basically strapped him to a mountain for eternity. And depending on the version you read, either an eagle either ate his heart or his liver every single day. So he couldn't really die, but he also wasn't fully alive. He was kind of trapped in this in-between world. And for me, Jack disappeared in a plane nicknamed Prometheus, right? And it was just this perfect symbol of the way my family was kind of dashed between hope and despair for 36 years. We didn't know if he was alive or dead. We really, my grandfather had nightmares about his son for decades. And the fact that it was an eagle, the symbol, again, of the American Air Force, which both my grandfather and uncle served in proudly, that was another, I think, difficult thing, that sense of an institution you believed in so deeply, kind of challenging your beliefs to their core. And what do you do with that? What do you do with the rest of your life that you're given when you still are uncertain about your son every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every Christmas? And part of what we inherit, yes, is that grief. Every generation in my family has lost a child, but it's also learning to not be completely defined by that. I think Jack was trying to be his dad when he rose up in that plane that night, just like, his father's World War II heroism. He wanted to be just like him. I wanted to be my mother for years. She wanted to be a journalist and a writer too. I wonder how much of that is from her. But we can't really live the lives of the people we love, we have to also know when to let them go. And that was kind of the growing lesson that I had through the process of writing this book and researching my family. We can inherit the best things, the laughter, the memories, the history, but also some tough lessons we kind of have to learn on our own.
So what's next? What's next for Jessica Pearce Rotundi?
Good question. I'm working on a new piece. It's still kind of new, so I don't want to say too much about it, but I think with so much of us being stuck indoors with the pandemic, I'm really re-examining the human relationship to nature, and a lot of artists and musicians throughout time, how they've developed a relationship, kind of a restorative one, with the natural world. So stay tuned for more on that.
I can't wait to read it. You have a glittering future ahead of you. I can't wait to read more. I recently read a piece, I think that you wrote. It was a historical piece on, on presidents.
Yes.
And, when President Trump fell ill from the coronavirus, you wrote a fascinating piece on presidents who have been hospitalized and the political consequence as a result. And so I see that you're still out there and you're still writing and you're keeping relevant. And I can't wait to read more. And so again, many, many congratulations on a terrific book. I asked our viewing audience to pick up the book. I downloaded mine on Amazon Kindle. There it is. And it's a terrific book. But Jessica, if our viewing audience wanted to follow you, to reach out to you, where can they do so?
Yes, they can visit me at jessicapearcerotundi.com. So it's JESSICAPEARCEROTONDI.com. You can also find me on Instagram or Twitter at Jessica Rotundi.
Jessica, thank you so much for spending time with us at Forward, Upward, Onward Together. This was a phenomenal conversation, an uplifting conversation, one that was just so honest. And I appreciate you spending the time to speak about the book, but also about your very interesting, fascinating family history. Again, thank you, our viewing audience, for watching us at Forward, Upward, Onward Together. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Like, subscribe, or comment on our page. Thank you.
You're watching RBNTV. We are networking, promoting, we're scoring points for you, proclaiming, declaring, here to encourage you. No matter the problem, we will enlighten you. We hear you, please listen. There is a point of view.